Welcome back to the Primal Shift podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about something super important, and those are nutrition labels, because those are the ones that can help you decide whether or not you want to buy a certain product when you're in the grocery store or not. More specifically, we talk about why you shouldn't trust most nutritional labels, or product labels in general, I should say. And we're going to talk about the top 14 misleading claims that you might find on product labels, on nutrition labels, that are confusing, misleading, and that might not mean anything at all. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about those, and I'll share tips with you that you can apply to make better purchasing decisions when you are in the grocery store and when you look at a product and try to figure out, is this something I want to put into my body, or should I maybe skip it? And with that, we're going to get right to it with the first label or claim that I see on a lot of product, and that is all natural. Well, all natural doesn't really mean anything at all, because most everything is natural. Arsenic, lead, phytoestrogens, E. coli, all of those are natural compounds. And so it doesn't really mean anything at all. Okay, maybe it means there's nothing synthetic in there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the natural ingredients the product has are healthy or good for you. So, all natural, not a very good thing to go by or a claim to go by if you want to figure out if you want to buy this product. The second one that I see a lot, maybe a little bit less so than in previous years, is fat-free or low-fat. Here is the thing. Products or food tastes good either if there is fat or if there is sugar in it. Salt can also play a role, of course, and that applies to both fatty and products rich in sugars. But generally speaking, if a product is fat-free or low in fat, unless it's naturally low in fat, for example, maybe a carrot, if that's what you care for, it often means that the manufacturer removed the fat and replaced it with sugar or with some sort of processed carbohydrates. And so good example are low-fat yogurts. Well, milk is naturally relatively high in fat, good fat that is. And so a low-fat yogurt simply means they added more sugar to make it palatable. Not a good thing. You definitely want to go for the high-fat yogurt versus the low-fat yogurt. And besides, fat, most animal fats are good for you, especially saturated fats. There is nothing wrong with them. It's a myth that they cause cardiovascular disease and clog up your arteries. And, even dietary cholesterol there is no issue with that whatsoever. And so low fat is actually something, if I see something labeled as low fat, I already know this is something I don't want to buy, because I want to buy high fat. I want to get the good stuff and not the high sugar stuff. Number 3, fortified. If it's fortified with vitamins and minerals, and that usually applies to processed foods. Milk too, to a degree, but you see that a lot on eggs, you see it as well, but especially on cereal, on breakfast cereals, you see, fortified with 1,000 minerals. That means a couple of things. If it needs to be fortified, that means that the core ingredients are void of nutrients, because why do we have to fortify it otherwise, right? So that's already an indication that you want to stay away from that product. And usually then the vitamins and minerals that are added are synthetic and absolutely worthless, or not absolutely, but mostly worthless, meaning they are poorly absorbed, they're not very bioavailable, and they usually end up in the toilet or cause other types of issues if the body misidentifies them, because they look chemically different, they have a chemically different structure than their natural counterpart. So fortified products just means junk product with synthetic ingredients or with synthetic minerals, micronutrients that are not going to help you at all. Gluten-free is another good example. If you suffer from celiac disease and you want to, buy something that might even be naturally gluten-free, but was maybe manufactured in a facility where cross-contamination is a possibility, then a gluten-free certification can be helpful. But in most cases, for people who do not suffer from celiac disease, gluten-free simply means that they replaced a gluten-containing grain, maybe wheat, with something else that's equally bad and just happen to not have gluten. Gluten are a type of protein that can cause issues, but some of the other proteins that are not gluten, that you might find in rice maybe, or in oats, they can be just as problematic. But very often gluten-free, like crackers and processed foods, they are made with nut flours, and those are highly irritating. So also something, unless a product is naturally gluten-free, I'd stay away from it. Great source of vitamins. That's another claim that is very misleading, because if something is a great source, there are only a few things that are great sources of vitamins and minerals, or micronutrients for that matter, and those are animal-based products, in particular, of course, organ meats. But also regular muscle meat and bone marrow and the fat, the saturated fat of responsibly raised ruminants great source of vitamins. But processed foods are usually not great sources of bioavailable and readily absorbable nutrients. There might be great sources of synthetic vitamins, but if the body cannot use them and cannot absorb them properly, it's really meaningless. Often you also see that claim on leafy greens. Like if you get a bag of kale or spinach, a great source of vitamin K, or great source of iron. Well, or great source of vitamin A in the example of maybe carrots or products made with carrots. The problem is those types of vitamins are not the ones that are most compatible with human physiology. You probably already know this, but there is heme iron and there is non-heme iron. The iron that humans can absorb efficiently and use readily is heme iron, which is found in animal products or in liver or in spleen, but even in regular muscle meat, in a piece of steak if you want. Vitamin K is another example. Well, and on the flip side to that is non-heme iron, and that's the stuff you find in plants. It's very poorly absorbed and not readily available. So spinach might be a great source of non-heme iron, but the body can only use a small percentage. That a piece of steak is a significantly better source of iron that the body can use than a pound of spinach. Same goes with vitamin K. There's K1 and K2, and there are different varieties, subcategories of K2. And the one you want is found in animal products, not the vitamin K1 in spinach or in maybe in kale. Same with beta carotene versus retinol in carrots. So there are different versions of those vitamins. Some of them are not actual vitamins, but precursors to a vitamin, like in the case of beta carotene. And so if you see great source of vitamins, and unless it's on a label of an organ meat or of an animal product, it is probably not what you think it is. Grass-fed, that's a very misleading term that you might find on a lot of animal products. So if you buy grass-fed meat, we all talk about, grass-fed meat is the best meat you can buy. Well, the thing is, every cow during a certain time of their life is grass-fed. You cannot raise calves on grain. They would get sick and die. Older cows get sick too, but they get slaughtered before they die, so you're not gonna notice. But calves, once they are weaned from the mom, they have to eat grass until they get finished on grain before slaughter time. And so grass-fed doesn't mean anything, because every beef that you buy came from a grass-fed cow, so absolutely meaningless unless the beef is also grass-finished, which means during the last few weeks of cow's life, they didn't get grains, which is the conventional way of finishing beef, but they stayed on grass, so that's a different. And so it's important to look for grass-fed and grass-finished if you really want to purchase beef from animals that only ate grass and nothing else. But there is also a wrinkle to this. In winter, typically here in the United States, cattle are fed hay if they are grass-fed, grass-finished, because if nothing's growing, they cannot, eat fresh pasture. And so they were getting hay in winter. Now there might, I don't think that exists, but technically speaking, you could raise a beef cattle on hay, which is arguably less nutritious than fresh pasture, and call it grass-fed, grass-finished. I don't know that there are cases out there or examples out there where someone would do this, because hay is more expensive than just pasture. But technically speaking, not even that might mean anything. So that's where the next term that comes into the equation, that is pasture-raised. Pasture-raised by itself doesn't really mean anything, because I can have something out on pasture and feed it supplemental feed, like pastured chickens, for example. There are no chickens in this country that you can buy commercially that don't receive supplemental feed. So they get grain, and depending on the type of feed, that might be negative to the bird's health. So just pasture-raised by itself doesn't mean anything, but in the realm of beef at least, if you can find pasture-raised, grass-fed, grass-finished, that's probably a best choice. And the safest bet that you're actually getting what you're thinking you're getting. But otherwise, pasture-raised or grass-fed, just by itself, might not really mean much. Number 7, healthy ingredients, or a variation of that, heart healthy. That's a term maybe that the USDA or the American Heart Association invented, the heart healthy. But what it basically means is healthy in the eyes of the USDA dietary guidelines. So, a lot of whole grains and nuts and seeds and very little meat and all of the things that, you should not be doing at all. So if you see a label heart healthy, or you see the term heart healthy on a product, it usually means it has a lot of fiber and a lot of whole grains and all kinds of stuff that you absolutely do not want in your diet. So heart healthy, if I see that on a label, I turn around and don't buy the product regardless of what it is. Even if it's something good and a company puts on heart healthy, I typically stay away from that. No sugar added. That's another potentially misleading. I mean, it's always good if a product doesn't have added sugars, no question about that. The problem is that, sometimes you can get away with a product that doesn't require extra sugar, but is still high in sugar. Apple juice or fruit juices in general are a good example. I mean, believe it or not, there are products out there like an apple juice that has added sugar. I don't know why you would add sugar to a beverage that's already naturally very, very sweet and that I would have to dilute to drink. But regardless, so there are, if you buy apple juice and it says no added sugar, well, that apple juice, that glass of apple juice might still have significantly more sugar than is good for you. I know that there are some proponents of animal-based eating out there that, put maple syrup or honey into their raw milk because it's not sweet enough for whatever reason. I don't think liquid carbohydrates are incredibly good. They burn very fast and they spike the blood sugar for ultimately no good reason unless you're physically incredibly active and you need in that particular moment quick carbohydrates to replenish your glycogen stores. Then drinking apple juice or whatever might be a reasonable choice, but for the average Joe like you and I don't think drinking liquid carbohydrates adds anything to your diet or health for that matter. And so products with no added sugar, be careful. One example that I come across a lot is, because we like it, is jelly. So you can buy, there are few brands of jelly out there that do not contain high fructose corn syrup, which is maybe one of the worst caloric sweeteners out there. But what they do is they use fruit juices to further sweeten the jelly. Is that better? Potentially. Is it great? Absolutely not. It still adds to the carbohydrate content without necessarily providing any nutrients that you need. I mean, jelly, if you have a raspberry jelly or whatever the type of jelly might be, the fruit should already be sweet enough so you don't need to add any extra. So no added sugar, have to be careful. Sometimes it also means non-caloric sweeteners were added, like sucralose or aspartame or ACE-K or whatever all of those things are called, that are potentially not good for you. Some of them might be benign, I don't know, but anything synthetic that acts like a sweetener but isn't, based on the studies I've seen, can thoroughly confuse your glucose metabolism, again, without adding any extra value, so be careful. Non-GMO is a term that is good often when you find it on a label, because if it's not genetically modified, it's definitely better than the alternative. However, non-GMO doesn't necessarily mean that the genetics were not changed by crossbreeding or selection, So for example, a very good example is if you buy chicken, in the store, it's a Cornish cross usually. I think in 99.99% of the cases when you buy a chicken in the store, it's a Cornish cross. That breed has been modified so much by selection and crossbreeding that it's ultimately an unhealthy bird that would have no chance of survival in nature if it wasn't for us propping it up with food and with very little movement and protecting it from predators because it couldn't even run, etc. So non-GMO is good, but that does not mean that genes have not been changed by other means, so be careful about that. Organic, it's goes hand in hand very often with non-GMO. In fact, when you buy organic, it's implicitly non-GMO because part of the organic certification program you cannot use GMOs or GMO ingredients. But the other thing with organic is most people believe, well, if it's organic fruit, that means it's no chemicals were used. And that is not true, because there is a list of allowed chemicals that are not necessarily healthy for you either, that can be used by farmers as part of their organic practices. And we realized that when we started growing some produce in our garden, and we went to the nursery and we got the organic plants, and then we looked for organic like supplements, like stuff we could prevent pests, etc., reduce the occurrence of pests, and all kind of thing that pesticides and herbicides that you might be looking for when you do conventional farming or conventionally raising produce or growing produce. And they're like, oh no, we have organic options, come on here, and they had like a whole shelf of organic pesticides and herbicides, and and if you read the label, it says, don't, wash your hands, don't inhale, and like warnings. I'm like, okay, if this is organic, but you cannot swallow it, you cannot, you have to wash your hands after, you cannot get it into your eyes. Is this really good? There are still chemicals that might be better less toxic maybe than the conventionally counterparts, but it doesn't mean organically grown produce is free of chemicals, so that's not what it means. And the other thing is that a lot of organic produce, especially on the berry side, like raspberries and strawberries, they are grown in hydroponics, they are grown in water, they are not grown in soil. That plant or that fruit or the plant that the fruit grew on never touched soil. And so you could argue from a nutritional perspective, if there was no soil involved, it's likely significantly less nutritious than a counterpart that was grown in soil. And so that's also something that you see sometimes with organic produce. You have to be careful about that, because you might end up buying produce that has fewer pesticides or fewer chemicals in general, but also fewer nutrients. And you need to make up for that. I mean, we buy organic berries that we know, like raspberries. I mean, we have our own, but if we need to buy some extra, we know that they are not nutritious. We just buy them for the taste, but not because they are a source of micronutrients for us. We use beef organs to make sure we get all the nutrients that we need. Pasture-Raised, we talked about this. I don't have to repeat it again. That by itself doesn't mean anything. Plant-based and vegan, that's another, you often see it like with a green, leaf or whatever, indicating health. I don't know when we decided that something green and plant-based should be mentioned in the same sentence as healthy, because first of all, I don't think plant-based from a nutritional perspective is incredibly healthy. And certainly not vegan. So if I see a product that says plant-based or vegan, unless it's a carrot that I want to buy, or unless it's just a piece of produce for that matter, or a piece of fruit, that usually doesn't carry that label, because there's no need to point out that an apple is plant-based or vegan. But if I see it on processed food, I stay away from it, because it usually means it's full of seed oils, soy, and some of the other plant-based ingredients that I do my best avoiding, because I know that they are not good for me. So if you see a product with plant-based or vegan label on it, it's probably not good, especially when it comes to, meat alternatives. Plant-based meats, absolutely horrible. Just look at the laundry list of nasty chunk ingredients that are on there. Vegan cheeses and all kinds of things, vegan bacon, probably the worst. There are so many things that are just absolutely horrible for your health, but labeled as potentially healthy and plant-based. Sugar-free. Sugar-free doesn't mean that the product has 0 sugar. It means, as per FDA labeling guidelines, that the product has less than 0.5 grams of sugar per serving. And that might not sound a lot. Like if you buy a 10-pound bag of something and it has 0.5 grams of sugar, it doesn't matter at all. But it matters when the serving size is relatively small. And one very good example is, I found those sweeteners, that you can use as a sugar alternative for coffee or tea or other beverages. And they are labeled sugar-free. And they contain, well, first of all, they contain sucralose, which is probably the worst artificial sweetener on the market. But more than that, each little pack actually contains 0.5 grams or 0.49 or whatever, just under the threshold of actual sugar. So there are people that pour 4 of those bags into their coffee, and if they do that, they get actually 2 grams of sugar, which is by no means sugar-free anymore for a cup of coffee, because that adds up. The more you use them, you might actually consuming a significant amount of sugar from sugar-free products. So you have to be careful about that. And then the other side we talked about already is the use of artificial sweeteners as replacements for sugar that are maybe just as bad, or for sure not ideal. They are certainly not conducive to optimal health, even if they might be. Let's say you're overweight and you want to cut out sugar, but you still need some sweets or whatever. Using those non-caloric sweeteners might be beneficial in certain cases, but they're definitely not good for you. The last one, and that's I think the most hilarious claim I've ever seen, because it's an admission of feeding animals a poor diet, is the label vegetarian fat. Especially on eggs, chickens, and pork. You see that very often. Made with vegetarian or made from vegetarian fat hens or vegetarian fat pigs, or on the carton of eggs, vegetarian fat hens. Neither chickens nor pigs are herbivores. They're omnivores. They thrive on eating meat, insects, frogs. You should see how our hens go nuts when they find a frog. They are by no means, vegetarian or plant eaters. They are omnivores, and they go nuts when they catch an animal as big as frogs. They just swallow it whole. Chickens don't, chew anyway. They just swallow, let the gizzard, that hard muscle that, contracts, and together with, they eat little pebbles and stuff to kind of grind the food down. And so they just swallow that whole frog whole and have a blast with it. So if you see on a label vegetarian fat from, on eggs or whatever, it just means that the brand admits feeding the animal an inappropriate diet. And so, that by itself would make me walk away. Unfortunately, you can find that claim on most eggs, even on some of the better ones. It says vegetarian fat. Just know that that's an admission of a less than ideal product. But if that's the only product you can find, it is what it is. But just know that it doesn't say anything about the quality of the product. If anything, it says that the eggs are probably not as good as eggs from hens that could eat insects and meat, for that matter. We feed our chickens sometimes, leftover meat, or if we kill an animal or whatever, and they peck on the carcass and they go nuts on animal protein and fat. Our young one, Isabella, actually, she fed our hens when they were smaller beef tallow, and they would go nuts with animal-based fat. So bottom line is, vegetarian fat, not very good. Now the question is, now that you've heard so many terms that are potentially misleading, and that you'll find probably on one of those at least on most processed foods that you can find in the store, the question is, what can you do to navigate that jungle? Well, first of all, remember what I said in this podcast. Maybe look at the show notes, print it out, and really try to remember what each of those terms might mean. The other thing I highly recommend is, whenever you approach a new product, don't even bother looking at the front, turn it around immediately and look at the ingredients list. So don't look at what it says, like, it has a lot of X, Y, Z, doesn't really matter. Turn it around and look at the ingredients. Usually the ingredients are listed in the order of the amount in the product. So whatever is the first ingredient is what it has most. But that can also be misleading. I've made that, or I've had that experience with pet food, with cat food in particular, where the first ingredient was some sort of, chicken meat or whatever. The problem is, and that's especially true maybe for wet food, that there is a lot of moisture in the meat, so that increases the weight of the primary ingredient. Even though if you strip away the water, it would not be the first ingredient anymore, and then maybe the starches that come next are actually in higher amounts in the product than what the label would suggest. So that's, again, to make it even more complicated, but the number one ingredient on the list might not always be the one that's actually a lot in the product. If you cannot pronounce the ingredient name, it's probably not good for you, very simple. Be aware of any products that make claims like the ones I mentioned. If there are some good products that make those claims and they're still good because they are true to what they are saying, but in most cases that is not the case, and so you have to be careful. Generally speaking, the fewer ingredients a product has, the better it is. The best products you can find have only one ingredient, like meat, or in the plant world, if you buy carrot, and it's organically grown, and you know where it came from, maybe from a local farmer, etc., that's much better than probably most of the pre-cut, sliced, and whatever products you can find packaged in the store. My best recommendation would really be buy products that don't have an ingredient label, period. Like, if you buy a piece of fresh meat from the butcher, you know that there is nothing in there. There are no funky juices that they put in, maybe, to preserve it. If it's packaged already, the same piece of meat might be of different quality, whether or not it's fresh and wrapped right there, or if it came pre-packaged in funky juices that might contain, preservatives or whatever that you don't really care for about. And don't be afraid to ask for third-party certifications. That's particularly true for, especially if you have celiac, obviously, and you want to make sure something is truly gluten-free, ask for a certification. Was it tested? But that's particularly true for supplements. If a manufacturer claims, oh, it's, whatever, low in heavy metals, or, or lab tested, ask for the test report. We at MK Supplements, we get asked that question a lot. In fact, we publish the test reports for, for glyphosate and for heavy metals and for certain pathogens. On our webpage in the help portal, so people can go there and they can look it up and they can look at the test report and the third-party certification thereof to make sure that what we claim is actually what's in the product. So don't be afraid to ask for this. Now with that, we're going to wrap it up. I hope this episode was helpful to you to navigate your grocery shopping a little bit better. Again, stay away from the center of the grocery stores. That's typically where all the processed foods are. Stick to the edge. Go around. That's typically where they produce and the fresh stuff is. And look at the labels and carefully read the labels. Try to understand them. If you don't understand, walk away. Do your research first before buying. Chances are you'll be better off. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. And I hope I'll see you and hear you in the next episode.